My daughter-in-law said, "We can't pay your bills, so we left you in an old age home." I never thought the day would come when my own son would look me in the eyes and tell me he couldn't take care of me anymore. I raised that boy. I washed his clothes, packed his lunches, sat up with him through fevers and nightmares and every heartbreak he ever had. And the day he drove away and left me standing in front of a building that smelled like antiseptic and loneliness, he didn't even look back. Not once. But here's the thing about life that nobody tells you when you're young: God has a way of turning tables. And when he does, he doesn't just flip them, he flips them hard. So sit with me for a minute, because what I'm about to tell you is something I lived through, something that broke me open completely, and something that ultimately set me free in ways I never expected. This is my story. My name is Dorothy Me Calloway. Most people who love me call me Dot. I'm 72 years old, and I have lived a full life, a hard life, but a full one. I was married for 41 years to a man named Gerald. He was quiet where I was loud, patient where I was quick, and he loved me the way a good tree loves the ground it grows in, steady, deep, and without a lot of fuss. We had one son together. We named him Marcus Gerald Calloway, and from the moment that boy was born, he was the center of everything we did. Gerald passed 7 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't give you much warning and doesn't give you much time. We had 8 months from diagnosis to funeral, and I spent every one of those months holding Gerald's hand, making sure he wasn't afraid. After he was gone, I told myself I was going to be okay. I told myself I had Marcus, and Marcus had me, and that was enough. For a while, it was. Marcus called every Sunday. He visited on holidays. He sent cards on my birthday and flowers on Mother's Day. He was a good son, or at least, he used to be. The trouble didn't start with Marcus, if I'm being honest with you. The trouble started the day he brought home Renee. Now, I want to be careful here, because I don't believe in speaking evil about people without telling the truth about myself too. When Marcus first introduced me to Renee, I was not warm to her. I'll admit that. She was polished and sharp-tongued, and she looked at my little house like she was calculating what it might sell for. She had opinions about everything: how Marcus dressed, what car he drove, which neighborhood they should live in. She was 28 years old, and she already had a 5-year plan that she had typed up and laminated. I'm not exaggerating. The woman had a laminated 5-year plan. I told Marcus privately that I thought she was cold. He told me I just needed to get to know her. They got married 6 months later in a ceremony that cost more than Gerald and I had made in our first 3 years of marriage combined. I sat in the front pew and I smiled and I clapped, and I told myself that if Marcus loved her, I would find a way to love her too. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I brought food when I visited. I offered to babysit when their daughter Lily was born. I stayed out of their business, and I bit my tongue so many times I'm surprised I have one left. But Renee had made up her mind about me before she ever gave me a real chance, and I felt it every single time I walked through their front door. The conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the way she'd sigh when Marcus suggested I join them for dinner, the little comments about how different our values were, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. But I held on, because of Marcus, because of Lily. That little girl was the light of my life. From the time she could walk, she would run to me whenever I came over and wrap her arms around my legs and say, Grandma Dot, like it was a song. Lily was the reason I kept making that 40-minute drive every other weekend. Lily was the reason I kept swallowing my pride. Everything shifted about 3 years after Gerald passed. I had a small stroke. Nothing devastating, praise God, but enough to scare me. My left hand shook a little more after that. I got tired faster. My doctor told me I needed to be more careful, needed someone checking on me regularly. I was still in the house Gerald and I had shared for 34 years, a modest 3-bedroom on Elmwood Drive with a garden out back and a porch swing where I'd spent more sunsets than I could count. Marcus came over when he heard about the stroke. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, and I could see something working behind his eyes. Something he was trying to say but hadn't shaped into words yet. He asked how I was doing. I told him the truth. I was managing, but it wasn't easy alone. He nodded a lot. He said things like, "We'll figure something out and don't worry, Mom." I felt comforted that day. I believed him. 2 weeks later, he came back. This time Renee was with him. They sat at my kitchen table together, and Renee had a folder, an actual manila folder with papers in it. She set it on the table between us like we were in a business meeting, and I felt something cold move through me before she even opened her mouth. She told me they'd been looking into options. She said the word options the way some people say, unfortunately, like it's meant to soften something that can't actually be softened. She said that with Marcus's salary and their mortgage and Lily's private school tuition and her own work schedule, it just wasn't realistic for them to take on my care at home. She said they'd found a very nice senior living facility about an hour away. She said they could help me with the deposit. I looked at Marcus the whole time she was talking. He wouldn't look back at me. I said, "Marcus, are you hearing what she's saying?" He said, "Mom, Renee has done a lot of research. The place is really nice. It's not what you might be picturing." I said, "What I'm picturing is my son sitting at a table while his wife tells me I'm too expensive to keep." Renee's jaw tightened. She said, very quietly, "Dorothy, we can't pay your bills. We have our own family to think about." There it was, right out in the open, like I wasn't his family, like the 41 years I'd given to building Marcus into the man sitting across from me didn't count as something she was enjoying the benefit of right now. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I didn't. I sat up straight the way my mother had taught me and I said, "I see. Let me think about it." But I already knew, sitting there in my own kitchen, at the table where I'd fed Marcus breakfast every morning for 18 years, that the decision had already been made. The folder was already open. The papers were already printed. I was already packed in their minds before they ever knocked on my door. I spent 2 weeks pretending to consider it. I called my sister Bernadette in Memphis and cried on the phone until I couldn't breathe. Bernie told me to come stay with her. I almost did. But something stubborn and proud in me said no. Something in me needed to face this head-on. So I agreed. I told Marcus I would try the facility for 6 months. I told myself 6 months wasn't forever. What I didn't know was that 6 months was exactly what Renee was counting on. The morning Marcus came to drive me to Meadow Pines Senior Living, I walked through every room of my house one time. I touched the door frame of the room where Marcus used to sleep. I stood in the garden where Gerald and I had planted roses the first spring after we moved in. I sat in the porch swing for exactly 5 minutes. And then I locked the door, put the key in my purse, and got in my son's car. He tried to make small talk on the drive. I answered in short sentences. We both knew what was happening, and dressing it up in pleasant conversation felt like an insult to the truth of it. Meadow Pines was fine. That's the best word I have for it. It was clean and it was organized and the staff was polite and the food was warm. There were activities in the afternoon and a little garden in the courtyard in a common room with a television that was always on too loud. There were other residents who had stories like mine, though we didn't talk about those stories in any detail. We talked about the weather and our grandchildren and whether they'd changed the pudding recipe in the dining hall. I had a roommate for the first 3 months. Her name was Evelyn, and she was 81 and she had the sharpest sense of humor I'd ever encountered in a human being. Evelyn had been dropped off by her daughter with a suitcase and a poinsettia plant that had died within the week. She told me about it like it was mildly funny. But at night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her crying. We never mentioned it in the morning. Some griefs are too tender for daylight. Marcus visited the first month. Then Renee started coming with him, and somehow those visits felt shorter than when he came alone. Lily came sometimes and sat on my bed and told me about school and made me laugh, and those were the best hours I had. But even Lily's visits started to thin out as the months went on. By month 4, I was lucky to see any of them twice a month. I started to understand something during those long evenings at Meadow Pines. I started to understand that I had built my entire life around other people, around Gerald, around Marcus, and that I had never quite figured out who Dorothy McCalloway was when she wasn't somebody's wife or somebody's mother. It was a painful thing to realize at 70 years old, but I'll tell you this, it lit something in me, a small fire, a quiet, stubborn refusal to let this be the end of my story. I joined the book club at Meadow Pines. I started writing in a journal. I made friends with a woman named Patricia who had been a librarian for 30 years and who knew something interesting about absolutely everything. I started calling Bernadette more. I started talking to my pastor on the phone every Thursday. And slowly, in ways I hadn't anticipated, I began to feel like a person again instead of a burden someone had set down. But that fire got tested. Oh, it got tested. It was a Tuesday in February, about 5 months into my time at Meadow Pines, when Patricia came and found me in the common room with a look on her face that made my stomach drop. She said there was a young man at the front desk asking for me. She said he was wearing a suit. His name was David Holt. He was a real estate attorney. And what he told me in that little conference room off the Meadow Pines lobby is the thing that changed everything. He told me that my house on Elmwood Drive had been sold. He said the closing had happened 11 days ago. He showed me the paperwork. He showed me Marcus's signature and Renee's and the power of attorney document that I had signed. Renee's suggestion, she had been so helpful about the paperwork, hadn't she, that gave Marcus the authority to make financial decisions on my behalf. I sat very still, the way you sit when the world is spinning but you don't want anyone to see it. My house, my 34-year home, the garden, Gerald's workshop in the back, the porch swing. My house was gone, and my son had sold it, and they had never said a single word to me about it. Mr. Holt said he was there because the title company had flagged an issue with the filing and needed a signature from me directly. He was apologetic and professional, and he clearly felt terrible. He had no idea that I hadn't known. He had assumed I knew. I thanked him. I shook his hand. I waited until he left, and then I went to my room and I closed the door and I sat on the edge of my bed and I did not move for 2 hours. My house had sold for $280,000. Gerald and I had paid $36,000 for it in 1987. We had paid it off completely. It was mine, free and clear, and now it was gone. And that money, all $280,000 of it, had gone into an account that I had no access to. I called Marcus that night. He answered on the 3rd ring, and when I told him I knew about the house, there was a silence that told me everything. Not surprise, not panic, just a long, guilty silence of a man who had hoped to avoid this conversation a little longer. He said they had done it to help pay for Meadow Pines. He said the costs were higher than expected. He said it was the practical thing to do. He said, and this is the part I will never forget for as long as I live, he said Renee had handled most of it and that she knew what was best for the family's finances. I said, Marcus, that was your father's house. He didn't say anything. I said, that was the house where I brought you home from the hospital. That was the house where your father died. I never I never gave you permission to sell that house. He said the power of attorney covered it. He said it was legal. I said, I'm not asking you if it was legal, Marcus. I'm asking you how you could. He didn't have an answer for that, and that silence was the loneliest sound I have ever heard. I cried that night. I cried the kind of crying you do when something inside you finally gives way, not from weakness but from the sheer weight of accumulated truth. I cried for Gerald. I cried for the version of Marcus I thought I'd raised. I cried for the grandmother I'd been trying to be for Lily, sitting an hour away in a facility while Renee collected the proceeds of my life's work. And then I stopped crying, and I made a decision. I called Bernadette in Memphis. And then I called my own attorney. His name was Franklin Webb, and he had handled Gerald's estate, and he was the kind of man who wore bow ties and spoke slowly and had forgotten more about the law than most people ever learn. I told him everything: the power of attorney, the house sale, the facility, the folder Renee had brought to my kitchen table. Franklin listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Dorothy, did you read the power of attorney document before you signed it? I told him I had trusted Marcus. I told him Renee had explained it as a formality. Franklin said, well, let's see what we're working with. What we were working with, it turned out, was a document that had some very significant limitations that Renee had either not understood or deliberately overlooked. The power of attorney Marcus held was what Franklin called a limited springing power of attorney. It was designed to allow financial decisions only under specific conditions, specifically my documented medical incapacity. A small stroke that I had fully recovered from did not meet that threshold. Marcus had sold the house without legal authority to do so. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I don't want you to think I did this out of revenge. I did not. I did it because I had spent my whole life making myself small to keep peace in other people's houses, and I was done. I was 72 years old, and I had maybe 20 good years left if God was willing, and I was not going to spend them in a room at Meadow Pines watching my son's wife manage my money while I ate pudding in a common room at 4 in the afternoon. Franklin filed a petition to have the power of attorney invalidated. He filed a claim against the proceeds of the house sale. He contacted the title company that Mr. Holt worked for and explained the situation. It was not a quick process. Nothing that matters ever is. Meanwhile, I told no one what I was doing. Not Marcus, not Renee, not even Patricia, though I came close a few times. I just kept going to book club and calling Bernadette and writing in my journal and waiting. Marcus called once a week, same as always. He was careful and polite the way people are when they know they've done something they can't fully justify. Renee sent a fruit basket for my birthday. Lily drew me a picture of a rainbow in a house, a detail that nearly undid me when I unfolded it. 3 months later, Franklin called me with news. The court had reviewed the power of attorney. The sale had been conducted outside its legal parameters. Marcus and Renee were ordered to return the net proceeds of the house sale to a court-managed account in my name, $261,000, after fees and costs. The house itself could not be unsold. The new owners were innocent parties, but the money was coming back to me. I held the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. There was more, because in the course of the legal review, it emerged that Renee had made several other small transfers from a joint account Gerald and I had kept, an old account with a small amount still in it that had technically passed to me and that she had moved without my knowledge. Franklin had flagged it. There was going to be a separate proceeding for that. Marcus called me the night the order came through. I could hear the shock in his voice, the disbelief of a man who had gambled on his mother's passivity and lost. He said he hadn't known all the details. He said Renee had managed most of it. He said he was sorry. I said, Marcus, do you know what your father used to say? He used to say that sorry is just a word until it grows legs. He was quiet. I said, I love you. I will always love you. But I need you to understand that what happened to me was not an accident. It was a choice. It was a series of choices. And those choices have consequences. He said, what are you going to do, Mom? I said, I'm going to go live my life. And that is exactly what I did. I left Meadow Pines on a Thursday morning in May. Patricia hugged me for a long time in the parking lot. Evelyn, who had been moved to a private room by then, waved at me from her window. I waved back. I had arranged to visit them both, and I meant it. Bernadette drove up from Memphis with her daughter and helped me find a small apartment not far from where Gerald and I used to live. 2 bedrooms, a little patio, room for container plants. Nothing like Elmwood Drive, but something that was mine, that I had chosen, that no one could sell out from under me. I hired a financial advisor, a woman named Gloria who wore her gray hair natural and spoke to me like I had a brain in my head, because I do. I set up my accounts properly. I made a new will. I updated my power of attorney to name Bernadette as my agent with conditions so specific that not even a Philadelphia lawyer could misread them. And I started writing. I'd always kept journals, but now I wrote in a more deliberate way. I wrote the story of Gerald and me. I wrote about raising Marcus. I wrote about the hard year after the stroke and the harder months at Meadow Pines. I wrote because it helped me and because I thought maybe it might help someone else someday. As for Marcus and Renee, that story isn't quite finished, and maybe it never will be. Marcus came to see me about 2 months after everything settled. He came alone. He sat in my new living room and he looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was small and he'd done something he knew was wrong, and he said, I let her make too many decisions. I didn't ask enough questions. I told myself you'd be okay and I didn't look close enough to make sure. I said, why? He thought about it for a while. He said, I think I convinced myself that making Renee happy was the same thing as doing right. And I know now that those aren't always the same thing. I said, no, they're not. I didn't forgive him that day. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. It's more like a door you have to walk up to 100 times before you finally open it. But I told him the door was still there. I told him I hadn't locked it. And I told him that Lily was welcome to come see me whenever she wanted, and that the grandmother I was going to be for that little girl was the fullest version of me I'd ever been. Renee and I have not spoken. I don't know that we will. Some broken things don't need to be repaired. They need to be let go, and something new grown in their place. I'll tell you what I know now that I didn't know when Marcus drove away from Meadow Pines without looking back. I know that the hardest trials of your life are also sometimes the ones that clear the ground for something better. I know that dignity isn't given to you by other people. It's something you carry inside yourself and refuse to put down no matter who asks you to. I know that a woman who has buried her husband and raised a son and kept a home for 34 years is not a burden. She is a treasure. And if the people around you can't see that, then the problem was never with the treasure. I sit on my little patio most evenings now. I have a container rose out there, a yellow one, because yellow was Gerald's favorite. I drink my tea. I read my book. Sometimes I call Patricia at Meadow Pines and we argue about whatever novel the book club is reading. Sometimes Lily comes over and we bake together, and she has her grandfather's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and she is going to be a remarkable woman someday. Sometimes I think about the morning I stood in the garden on Elmwood Drive and said goodbye to the house. I think I was grieving then in a way I didn't have the language for yet. I was grieving the version of my life I thought was permanent. But here's what I've come to understand. Permanent is a story we tell ourselves. The real stuff, the love you gave, the person you are, the way you kept going even when your own son drove away without looking back. That's the stuff that doesn't sell. That's the stuff no one can take from you. I am Dorothy Me Calloway. I'm 72 years old. I have been left behind and I have found my way back. And if you are sitting somewhere tonight feeling like a burden, feeling like the people who were supposed to love you have decided you cost too much, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not a bill to be paid. You are not an obligation to be managed. You are a person with a whole life inside you, memories and love and hard-won wisdom that nobody can put a price on. And your story, honey, your story is not over. Not even close.